The yellow school bus, 147, rumbled down River Road every weekday afternoon at exactly 3:45 p.m., as predictable as the seasons that changed around the tiny Pennsylvania town of Willowbrook. On that February afternoon in 1985, 8-year-old Emma Walsh bounced in her seat as always, clutching her pink backpack and chatting with her best friend Lily about the upcoming school talent show. The driver, Mrs. Henderson, had made this route for 15 years and knew every child by name, watching them grow from kindergarten through high school in her oversized rearview mirror. When the bus wheezed to a stop at the corner of River Road and Maple Lane, Emma grabbed her things and hopped down the 3 steep steps with practiced ease, her brown pigtails bouncing behind her as she called goodbye to Lily through the window. Mrs. Henderson watched as she always did, making sure Emma safely crossed the small drainage ditch and began walking up the gravel driveway toward the modest farmhouse where she lived with her mother Janet, father David, and younger brother Tommy. But that day, as Mrs. Henderson shifted the bus into gear to continue her route, something made her glance back in the mirror one more time. The driveway stretched empty ahead, leading to a house that would wait in vain for its daughter to come home. Emma Walsh had taken no more than 20 steps from the bus before vanishing as completely as if the February air had swallowed her whole, leaving behind only the faintest impression of small footprints in the muddy ground before they, too, were lost to time. The massive search that followed became the largest missing child investigation in the county's history, consuming 3 months of intensive effort by local police, state authorities, and hundreds of volunteers who combed every inch of the surrounding farmland, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. But despite countless leads, alleged sightings, and the deployment of bloodhounds, helicopters, and thermal imaging equipment, no trace of Emma Walsh was ever found, and the case eventually grew cold, leaving a family shattered and a community forever changed by the knowledge that a child could disappear in broad daylight from the safest possible place and leave no trace behind. The years that followed Emma's disappearance transformed Janet Walsh from a vivacious mother of 2 into a hollow-eyed crusader who refused to abandon hope despite the mounting evidence that her daughter was gone forever. Every morning she would wake before dawn to prepare Tom for school, then spend hours at the kitchen table surrounded by files, photographs, and maps, coordinating with other families of missing children and maintaining a detailed log of every potential lead that crossed her desk. David tried to support his wife's tireless efforts while also attempting to provide some sense of normalcy for Tom, but the strain of living in a house that felt simultaneously too empty and too full of reminders proved overwhelming, and by the 3rd year after Emma's disappearance, he had moved into a small apartment in town, visiting regularly but unable to sleep in a bedroom where Emma's twin bed still sat perfectly made with its rainbow unicorn comforter. Janet filled Emma's absence with purpose, founding a local chapter of the National Center for Missing Children, organizing annual awareness walks, and pestering law enforcement agencies to keep the investigation active long after most similar cases would have been relegated to cold storage. She maintained Emma's room exactly as it had been the day she vanished, down to the half-completed math homework still spread across the small white desk and the library book about horses that was now 15 years overdue, but which the librarian had removed from the system rather than asking for its return. She learned to read police reports like a trained investigator, studying crime patterns, suspicious vehicle sightings, and registered sex offender databases until she knew the details better than most of the officers assigned to the case. When Detective Mike Brennan took over as lead investigator in 1990, replacing the retiring Sergeant Morrison, who had handled the initial investigation, he found himself dealing with a constituent who knew more about her daughter's disappearance than he did, and rather than finding her involvement intrusive, he came to rely on Janet's meticulous records and intuitive understanding of how predators operated in rural communities, Over the years, the case took them down numerous dead ends, from a drifter who had been seen near the area that week to a construction worker whose erratic behavior had raised suspicions, but each lead would crumble under scrutiny, leaving them back where they started with more questions than answers. Janet developed a network of contacts across multiple law enforcement agencies, established relationships with forensic experts who sometimes consulted on the case pro bono, and even hired 2 different private investigators when her husband Tom's life insurance policy provided a small windfall that she immediately directed toward the search for their daughter. By the time 8 years had passed, most people in Willowbrook had grown uncomfortable with Janet's inability to accept what seemed to be the inevitable truth that Emma was gone and would never be coming home, but Janet only intensified her efforts, convinced that somewhere in the vast collection of information she had gathered lay the key to understanding what had happened to her daughter that February afternoon. The construction of the new Willowbrook shopping centre had been delayed for years due to environmental concerns, budget issues, and a lengthy dispute over land rights that had kept the 12-acre site empty, except for the occasional homeless encampment and teenage gathering spot. When ground was finally broken in August of 1993, the construction crew found themselves dealing with a site that had accumulated nearly a decade's worth of debris, overgrown vegetation, and the detritus left behind by countless temporary occupants. The crew foreman, Mike Torres, had grown up in Willowbrook and remembered when news of Emma Walsh's disappearance had dominated local headlines, though like most residents, he had gradually accepted that the mystery would never be solved and had moved on with his life. It was during the excavation phase, as heavy machinery cleared years of accumulated brush and exposed the red clay soil beneath, that something caught Torres's attention, a splash of color that seemed deliberately placed rather than randomly discarded. Curiosity. Overcoming his better judgment, Torres climbed down from his bulldozer and approached what appeared to be a partially buried notebook, its once bright cover now faded but still recognizable as the type carried by schoolchildren throughout the region. As he brushed away the dirt and debris, his heart began to race when he saw the name written in careful cursive on the front cover amid a border of hand-drawn hearts and stars. Emma Walsh. The notebook, a standard 3-ring binder that had somehow remained structurally intact despite 8 years of exposure to the elements, contained pages that were water-damaged but still partially legible, filled with the typical assignments and doodles of an 8-year-old girl, including what appeared to be draft pages of the science fair project she had been working on when she disappeared. Torres immediately called the police, who arrived within 20 minutes and established a perimeter around the discovery site, treating it as potentially the first piece of physical evidence in a case that had consumed the department for nearly a decade. Detective Brennan took personal charge of the excavation, bringing in a team of evidence technicians and a forensic archaeologist from the State University to carefully process the site. Over the following week, as construction was suspended, the team uncovered not just Emma's notebook, but a collection of items that painted a disturbing picture: a child's hair barrette, 2 candy bar wrappers with dates from late 1985, a small plastic toy car, and, most significantly, a photograph wrapped in plastic that showed Emma at what appeared to be a birthday party, though neither the location nor the other children in the photo could be immediately identified. The discovery reignited the investigation with an intensity that surprised even the most optimistic observers, bringing in resources from the state police, the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, and a host of forensic specialists who began processing the site with techniques that hadn't existed when Emma first disappeared. For Janet Walsh, the call from Detective Brennan confirming that Emma's notebook had been found represented both the answer to years of prayer and the beginning of what she feared might be the most heartbreaking chapter of her ordeal. The moment when hope and dread collided with renewed force. The forensic analysis of the construction site took on an urgency that surprised even veteran law enforcement professionals who had seen their share of cold cases suddenly come to life. Using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and systematic grid searches, investigators spent 3 weeks meticulously processing every square foot of the area where Emma's notebook had been discovered, uncovering a timeline of deposits that suggested the site had been used as a dumping ground for various items over multiple years. Dr. A. Sarah Kim, the forensic archaeologist leading the excavation, determined that Emma's belongings had been buried approximately 3 to 4 years after her disappearance, not immediately following the crime, suggesting the perpetrator had initially hidden the items elsewhere before relocating them to the construction site. This finding led Brennan to revisit the original investigation with new eyes, particularly focusing on individuals who had lived in the area during both time periods and had detailed knowledge of local geography. The photograph found wrapped in plastic proved particularly significant when photo analysis experts determined it had been taken with a specific model of instant camera popular in the mid-1980s, and the background element suggested it had been shot at a private residence rather than a public location. Janet Walsh immediately recognized the party dress Emma had worn in the photo as one she had never seen before, raising the horrifying possibility that her daughter had been held captive and moved between locations before whatever final tragedy had befallen her. The investigation expanded to include a comprehensive review of all adults who had been living within a 20-mile radius of the disappearance site in 1985, cross-referenced with property records, employment histories, and any previous interactions with law enforcement. Brennan's team discovered that the area around the construction site had been more developed in the 1980s than currently realized, with several small businesses and a trucking depot that had since relocated, providing numerous potential explanations for how someone might have accessed the site without drawing attention. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts suggested the perpetrator was likely someone familiar with the daily rhythms of the community, someone who had planned the abduction carefully and had significant means to keep a child hidden for an extended period. Within weeks of the discovery, 5 persons of interest had been identified, including a former truck driver who had made regular deliveries through Willowbrook, a maintenance worker who had been fired from the school district for inappropriate behavior shortly before Emma's disappearance, and most intriguingly, a local businessman who had owned property near the construction site and had relocated to Florida in 1988, citing business opportunities. Each of these individuals was tracked down and interviewed, their homes and properties searched with warrants, and their alibis from 1985 scrutinized with the attention to detail that only time and distance allow. The investigation had transformed from a cold case review into an active manhunt, with resources flowing in from state and federal agencies and a renewed sense of urgency driving everyone involved to believe that answers were finally within reach. As the investigation intensified, disturbing patterns began to emerge that suggested Emma's disappearance might have been connected to a broader network of criminal activity operating in rural Pennsylvania during the 1980s. Detective Brennan's team discovered that the trucking depot near the construction site had been used as a front for a regional drug distribution operation that had been under federal investigation from 1984 to 1987, though the investigation had been abruptly terminated when key suspects had disappeared and evidence had been destroyed in a suspicious warehouse fire. Even more unsettling was the revelation that 3 other young girls had vanished from small towns along the same trucking corridor during roughly the same time period, disappearances that had been handled by different jurisdictions and never properly cross-referenced until now. Each case shared eerily similar characteristics: children between the ages of 7 and 10, taken during daylight hours from locations near major trucking routes, with absolutely no witnesses despite the relatively public nature of the abductions. When agents pulled the files on these parallel cases, they discovered that one of the suspects in Emma's disappearance, the former school maintenance worker named Gerald Pike, had been employed at schools in all 3 locations during the critical time periods, a connection that had somehow been missed in the original investigations. Pike, now 58, and living in a rundown trailer park in West Virginia, initially claimed to have no memory of Emma Walsh or any of the other missing children, but when confronted with records showing his presence at each school during the relevant time frames, his story began to change. Under pressure during a 6-hour interrogation, Pike admitted to having photographed children at school events without permission and to maintaining what he called a personal collection of child-related materials, though he continued to deny any involvement in the actual disappearances. A search of his trailer yielded dozens of photographs of children from various schools where he had worked, along with newspaper clippings about missing persons cases dating back 20 years, but despite extensive forensic analysis, no physical evidence linking him directly to Emma or any of the other missing children could be found. The investigation then took an unexpected turn when a retired FBI agent who had worked the original trucking depot case reached out to Brennan with information that had never been officially documented, claiming that several high-ranking members of the organization had been involved in human trafficking operations that included both drug mules and children, though the evidence had been deemed too circumstantial to pursue at the time. This agent, Robert Martinez, had spent years in private security after leaving the Bureau, and he had continued to track several of the suspects he had been forced to abandon during the official investigation. His files contained surveillance photos, financial records, and what he described as credible intelligence, suggesting that a core group of 6 individuals had operated a criminal enterprise that had moved children through a network of safe houses stretching from Pennsylvania to Florida, using the trucking business as both cover and transportation method. Martinez's information led investigators to re-examine the businessman who had owned property near the construction site, discovering that he had been one of the largest customers of the trucking depot during the years in question and had maintained mysterious business relationships with several individuals who had since died under suspicious circumstances or disappeared entirely. The breakthrough came when investigators located a former truck driver named Bobby Stevenson, who had worked for the trucking depot in 1985 and had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation, but had been dismissed as a potential suspect due to conflicting alibis. Stevenson, now suffering from emphysema and living in a nursing home in Virginia, had been experiencing increasing difficulty with dementia, but retained crystal-clear memories of specific events from decades earlier. When Detective Brennan showed him photographs of Emma Walsh and asked about his deliveries along River Road in February of 1985, Stevenson began to describe details that had never been made public, including Emma's pink backpack and the muddy conditions on the day she disappeared. Under careful questioning designed to avoid leading him to any particular conclusions, Stevenson revealed that he had been approached by his supervisor, James Walsh, the same businessman who owned property near the construction site and shared, coincidentally, Emma's surname, though no relation, about making special deliveries to a property outside of normal routes. According to Stevenson, these deliveries had occurred monthly and had involved unmarked packages that he was instructed to carry to a specific location on the property rather than the main office, often meeting with men he didn't recognize and who seemed deliberately secretive about the nature of the cargo. The property, which Stevenson was able to describe in detail despite the passage of decades, had been developed with several small outbuildings that he remembered thinking seemed oddly secure for their rural location, with heavy locks and what appeared to be soundproofing materials. Most significantly, Stevenson recalled making a delivery to this property 3 days after Emma's disappearance, a delivery that had been unlike any he had made before, consisting only of cleaning supplies, concrete blocks, and what he described as digging tools, items that had struck him as unusual at the time, but which he had attributed to construction needs. The property in question had been sold in 1987 and had changed hands several times since then, with the outbuildings torn down in the early 1990s to make way for a horse stable that had never been completed. When investigators located the current property owners and received permission for a comprehensive search, they brought in anthropological experts, cadaver dogs, and specialized excavation equipment, discovering within 48 hours what appeared to be a deliberately concealed concrete depression in the ground where one of the outbuildings had stood. The excavation of this site would take 2 weeks of painstaking work, during which time additional items belonging to Emma were discovered, along with evidence suggesting the presence of other children in what investigators began to describe as a purpose-built containment facility. The most devastating discovery came when anthropologists identified what appeared to be human remains at a depth of 6 feet, along with fabric fragments that Janet Walsh would later identify through tears of both relief and anguish as coming from the dress Emma had worn on the morning of her disappearance, a dress that she had sewn herself from a pattern purchased during a weekend trip to Lancaster County, a dress that Emma had specifically chosen because it matched her mother's own dress from years earlier, making them twins for that special day that had become the last day Janet Walsh would ever spend with her daughter. The arrest of James Walsh came at dawn on a rainy Tuesday morning in September, coordinated simultaneously with raids on properties in 3 states that had been identified through his business records and the testimony of Bobby Stevenson. Walsh had been living under an assumed name in a gated community in Jacksonville, Florida, where neighbors described him as a quiet retiree who kept to himself and had no apparent family connections or close friendships. The evidence collected over months of investigation painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal network that had used legitimate business operations as cover for what federal prosecutors would later describe as one of the most extensive child trafficking rings ever uncovered in the Mid-Atlantic region. Walsh himself remained silent during his initial questioning, exercising his right to legal counsel and entering a plea of not guilty at his arraignment, though his attorneys would eventually acknowledge the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. Gerald Pike, the former maintenance worker who had initially drawn suspicion, was arrested as well, charged with conspiracy and evidence tampering after forensic analysis of his computer equipment revealed he had been in communication with Walsh during the period when Emma's belongings were moved to the construction site. 3 other individuals connected to the original trucking depot operation were indicted on federal charges related to trafficking and racketeering, while 2 additional suspects had died before they could be apprehended, including Walsh's primary business partner who had died in what had been ruled a boating accident in 1989, but which investigators now viewed with considerable suspicion. The legal proceedings would stretch over 18 months, during which time the remains of 4 additional children would be discovered at various properties connected to the network, providing closure to families who had waited decades for answers to their own mysteries. Janet Walsh attended every hearing, often sitting in the front row where James Walsh could not avoid seeing her, her presence a silent testimony to the decades of suffering his actions had caused. During impact statements, she would speak directly to Walsh, addressing him by name and describing each of the 8 years she had spent looking for Emma, each false lead she had followed, each night she had lain awake wondering if her daughter was somewhere crying for her mother. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts related to the trafficking enterprise. The judge, in sentencing Walsh to life in prison without the possibility of parole, described the case as representing evil of the most calculated and systematic nature, noting that the defendants had not merely committed crimes of opportunity, but had built an entire infrastructure designed to facilitate the harm of children while evading detection for decades. For the families of the victims, the sentences brought a measure of justice, but could not restore what had been lost, or undo the years of anguish that had fundamentally altered their lives and shaped their understanding of the world as a place where unimaginable evil could hide behind the facade of ordinary community life. The aftermath of the trials revealed the true scope of how deeply the trafficking network had penetrated not just Willowbrook, but multiple communities across several states, leading to a comprehensive review of law enforcement practices and interjurisdictional cooperation that would result in significant policy changes at both state and federal levels. Janet Walsh, whose tireless advocacy had been instrumental in keeping Emma's case active and ultimately led to the discovery of the broader criminal enterprise, found herself testifying before congressional committees about the need for better resource allocation and coordination in missing persons cases involving children. Her detailed documentation of the investigation, which included over 10,000 pages of notes, interviews, and analysis gathered over 8 years, became a case study used in law enforcement training across the country, demonstrating how persistence and methodical investigation could overcome even the most sophisticated attempts to conceal crimes. The Willowbrook Police Department, which had faced criticism for the initial handling of Emma's disappearance, implemented new protocols for rapid response to missing children reports and established one of the first rural child advocacy centers in Pennsylvania, providing specialized resources for investigating crimes against children and supporting affected families. Detective Mike Brennan, who had dedicated much of his career to solving Emma's case, was promoted to head a new regional task force focused on cold cases involving missing children, using the lessons learned from the investigation to help crack dozens of similar cases across the state. The construction site where Emma's notebook had been found was donated to the community by the developer and transformed into Emma Walsh Memorial Park, featuring not just a playground and picnic area, but also educational installations about child safety and prevention of abduction. The park's design incorporated elements that honored all the children whose cases had been connected to the trafficking ring, with a central memorial featuring a sculpture of children playing, a deliberate choice to celebrate joy and innocence rather than focusing on tragedy. Janet Walsh became a frequent speaker at conferences and workshops, sharing both practical advice for families dealing with missing children and insights into the psychological resilience required to sustain hope over extended periods. She collaborated with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to develop new resources for families, including a comprehensive guide that addressed everything from working with law enforcement to managing media attention to maintaining family relationships under extraordinary stress. Her work led to the passage of several state laws, including one requiring law enforcement agencies to maintain active investigation files on all missing persons cases and to review them regularly with fresh eyes and new technologies. The house on River Road where Emma had lived remained in the Walsh family, though Janet eventually moved into town, converting her daughter's childhood home into a respite center for families of missing children, a place where they could find support, resources, and community among others who understood their unique form of grief. David Walsh, who had remarried and started a new family, remained actively involved in his son Tom's foundation, named the Emma Walsh Memorial Foundation, which provided scholarships to law enforcement officers pursuing specialized training in child protection and investigation. The yellow school bus, M47, no longer traveled River Road, the route having been modified years earlier due to safety concerns. But Mrs. Henderson, now retired, maintained a small shrine in her garage to all the children she had driven to school over 4 decades of service, with Emma's photograph occupying the central position among dozens of school portraits and handwritten thank you notes. Standing in Emma Walsh Memorial Park on a warm September afternoon in 2005, 20 years after her daughter's disappearance, Janet Walsh reflected on how the landscape of grief had evolved from paralyzing loss to purposeful action, though the fundamental absence remained unchanged. The park was full of children playing, their laughter rising above the sounds of construction from the adjacent shopping center that had finally been completed, its clean lines and modern architecture standing as a monument to progress and renewal in a community that had learned to coexist with its darkest memories. Tom, now 32 and a father of 2 young daughters, joined his mother at the memorial sculpture, watching as his own children darted between playground equipment that incorporated safety features unimaginable in the 1980s, from electronic monitoring systems to strategic visibility corridors designed by experts in child protection. They spoke quietly about Emma, sharing memories that had been polished smooth by repetition, but remained precious precisely because of their familiarity, discussing how different everything might have been if she had lived to see this moment, to become an aunt, to witness the changes her death had brought to their community and beyond. Janet had helped plan this gathering, coordinated to coincide with the 10th anniversary of James Walsh's sentencing, bringing together families of all the children whose cases had been connected to the trafficking ring, along with the investigators, prosecutors, and advocates who had worked to bring justice. The event served multiple purposes: a memorial for those lost, a celebration of the progress made in child protection protocols, and an opportunity for survivors to connect with others who understood their journey through grief towards something resembling peace. Detective Brennan, preparing for retirement after 35 years in law enforcement, delivered remarks that acknowledged the imperfect nature of justice while honoring the memory of the children and the persistence of their families, noting that while nothing could undo what had been done, the changes implemented in response to these cases would protect countless other children in years to come. As the afternoon wore on, families gathered in small groups, sharing stories and contact information, forming connections that would extend beyond this commemorative gathering into ongoing networks of support and advocacy. Janet found herself counseling a woman whose daughter had been missing for only 6 months, offering both practical advice about navigating law enforcement systems and the hard-won wisdom about how to maintain hope without letting it consume you entirely, how to honor a missing child while still living your own life. The work continued because it had to continue, because predators still operated in every community, because children still disappeared and families still needed support, but also because people like Janet Walsh had discovered that turning tragedy into purpose provided a way to live with loss that made the unbearable somehow bearable. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in the soft pastels of approaching autumn, she stood once more before the memorial sculpture, placing a fresh bouquet of pink roses at its base before joining the gathering crowd for a candlelight vigil that would officially close the ceremony but would, in a very real sense, mark the continuation of work that would never truly end until every missing child was found, every family had answers, and every community had the tools and will to protect its most vulnerable members. If you're watching this from somewhere touched by the story of Emma Walsh, or from any community where a child has gone missing, take a moment to consider how one person's determination can reshape systems that seemed immovable, how one family's refusal to accept the unacceptable can catalyze changes that protect thousands of other families. The investigation that began with a notebook buried for 8 years ultimately dismantled a trafficking network that had operated for decades, brought closure to numerous families, and revolutionized how law enforcement approaches missing children cases in rural communities. But beyond the systemic changes, Emma Walsh's story continues to remind us that every missing child represents not just a statistic, but a unique individual whose absence creates an irreversible hole in the fabric of countless lives, from immediate family to extended community to strangers moved by their story. Janet Walsh's journey from grieving mother to nationally recognized advocate demonstrates that while we cannot always control the tragedies that befall us, we retain agency in how we respond to them, how we channel our pain into purpose, and how we use our experiences to benefit others facing similar challenges. If you know someone dealing with a missing family member, reach out with practical support rather than empty platitudes, understanding that the families of missing children exist in a unique state of suspended grief that requires both acknowledgement and ongoing assistance. Like and subscribe to stay informed about similar stories of resilience, investigation, and the long path toward justice, because sharing these narratives keeps important issues in public consciousness and can sometimes provide crucial information that leads to breakthroughs in cold cases. The bell icon ensures you won't miss updates on other stories that demonstrate how ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances can affect changes that ripple outward to benefit entire communities. Whether you're watching from a small town like Willowbrook or a major metropolitan area where anonymity can make finding the missing even more challenging, remember that every share, every comment, every moment of engagement contributes to an environment where these stories remain visible and relevant, where the missing are not forgotten, and where the lessons learned from tragedy continue to inform better practices for protecting children and supporting families. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply bear witness, to refuse to let these stories fade into historical footnotes, to insist on their continued relevance in discussions about child safety, criminal justice reform, and the ways communities respond to trauma and work toward healing in its aftermath.